you can see right here. Can you read it?
March 15th.
No, my name. Edwin
Yeah,
Stevens.
Edwin. I can see it right
Yeah,
here.
Edwin
It's
Stevens.
right up
Oh,
here.
it's right there too.
That's why I went for the birth date.
And I lived till I was 83 years old. And most of that time, I spent my life as a farmer. So I've got my bib overalls that I was used to wearing most of my life. I grew up on my father's farm, and I actually didn't get married till I was 31 years old. And I married my wife Jane Knott, who was a young lady from over in Westfield. Met her, and we ended up having a family together. We had 6 children. 2 of them were born after a very short but significant part of my life. And that was the 1.5 years that I spent in the Army. So I spent many decades on the farm, but less than 2 years in the Army. And I enlisted when I was 40 years old. Actually, I was 39. I was 2 months short of being 40. So a lot of young men had gone off to war, and there was a lot of death and destruction during that war. And the 27th Regiment, the regiment that I belonged to, had been decimated during 2 large battles, and they had lost most of their numbers. Now, a regiment is around 1,000 people, between 900 and 1,000, and they had lost a great number of those. So I joined 2 years after the regiment was formed, and I was a replacement. And I was part of, you see the company right here, I was in Company F. And that company was comprised of men from Southwick and Tolland and Westfield and Blandford. The different companies came from different regions. We were all from Western Mass. The 27th was all from Western Massachusetts. Well, I joined as a replacement and was shipped down south and served with the Army. In the Southern campaign, we were actually in Roanoke for a while. That was kind of easy duty. But then we were assigned to a campaign that was coming up from the south towards Richmond. And most people know about the Battle of Petersburg and the Siege of Petersburg. Well, I never got there. On the way up, we happened to run into a little bit of trouble in this meadow area called Arrowfield Church, because there was a church right there, and there was a stream that ran through. It was Swift Brook, and Swift Brook, the banks were so deep and the water ran so fast that the infantry couldn't get through it. And we were going down the road on the way to Arrowfield Church, when we started getting fire from across the stream. So our officers brought up the rest of the companies. There had just been skirmishers out to start with. They brought up the rest of the companies, my company included, and we started getting what's called galling fire. We started getting fire from artillery and from musketry. And the officers formed us up into a V formation. And on our left was a Rhode Island regiment, and on our right was another Massachusetts regiment. But we were the front of that spear that was going towards the church and towards the Confederate troops. And wasn't that heavy compared to other battles we had been in, but all of a sudden, on the other side of the stream, on the other side of the meadow, a whole regiment of men stood up. And we found out later that they were from the South Carolina troops. Now, South Carolina, they said they were a sworn enemy of Massachusetts because we were abolitionists and they were the first ones to withdraw from the Union. So they all stood up and they started the Confederate yell. I don't know if you ever heard that, but it's a scream. It's a high-pitched scream. And they all screamed at the same time. They started running towards us. Well, we started firing, and our officers told us, you wait. Just like at Bunker Hill, you wait till you get the order, because our general said we had been wasting ammunition. We had going through too much ammunition. So we waited till they were about 200 yards from us, and their officers told us to let go. And it was like harvesting a field of wheat. All the men just fell down in front of us. But they kept coming, and they kept coming. and I got shot. And I'll pass these around. People who haven't seen, this
That's
is
heavy. That's
this is a 57 caliber Confederate projectile, and you can pass those around. And I got hit once in my leg, but it was a spent shell. It meant it wasn't at full speed. And what it did is it shattered my leg. It broke my leg right up here. And the other one hit me in the shoulder, and that took me out of the battle. I was laying down in the field when the battle ended, and we were told that because of the stream that our troops could not follow up. So it really was kind of a draw. We think of it as being a victory for us, but the history books list it as a draw, and probably none of you have ever heard of Arrowfield Church.
No.
You know, that's the way a lot of these wars work, is people really hear about the major battles and they hear about the generals, but they don't hear about these little skirmishes, these little battles that really affected people. Well, as I said, I was only in the Army for a year and a half. At the end of that time, after the battle, and after convalescing from my wounds, and my leg never really healed upright, the bone. And even at 83 years old, my shoulders never healed. The rest of my life, I've always had to keep this packed because it's bled for all 40 years after I was wounded.
Excuse me, was the actual shot still in your shoulder? Is that why it kept bleeding? Or
No, it went all the way through. It shot. Well, you know how heavy it is. What happens?
Yeah, well, I saw it's heavy.
What happens is it has a hollow base. So as the gunpowder explodes and makes gas, this hollow base flares out and it bites into the rifling in their muskets. And this is very soft lead. So when the soft lead hits the bone, it opens up. And it just shattered everything in there. So they were able to put me back together, but things never healed right. But I was better off than a lot of other people. Better off than some and worse off than others. As I mentioned on the way up here, you're just going to go past not the first flag, but the second flag. There is little Holcomb, and Holcomb was in my company too, and he was wounded in the hand. He got off pretty easy, I'd say. But I came back to Southwick here. I lived on what's called Loomis now, and had two more children, my youngest being a boy, and all of the family really moved off into other areas except my daughter Mary. My wife and my daughter are buried right here with me. I can tell you more stories about farming, but I think people were mostly interested about that time that I spent in the Army during the war.
Noah brought his wife and older children to Southwick from his birthplace of Smithfield, Rhode Island in the early 1800s. Bartlett's had 12 children living in August of 1821. I do have their names here if you'd like to look at them. The boys were Isaac, Noah, Jeremy, and Barlow. And pardon some of these names, I don't know the pronunciations if I'm right, but girls were Polly, Elzada, Sabra, Lydia, Vesta, Kezia, Fanny, and Harriet. The Kezia, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that one totally, but you'll have to pardon me. So Noah Bartlett died in Southwick on August 1st of 1821. His property was distributed between his children and a widow's portion, which was about a third of the estate. His wife received an offer of marriage from David Enos of Granby, Connecticut in 1825. But she usually, when a husband remarried, the estate, her part she inherited would become part of her husband's. She had the foresight to require him to sign a document that any property she inherited would be continued to her children and not part of his holdings. So imagine she had a prenuptial agreement years ago. So, and according to the 1840 and 1850 census, Lydia was living with Harriet in Selden. Actually, it was the property that she had with her husband. And when Lydia died, she was buried beside her first husband, Noah. Their gravestones are on the little poster here. And her gravestone reads, Lydia Enos, relic of Noah Bartlett, died February 11, 1856, age 79. Now, do you know what relic means? I don't know if everybody knows. That was an old-time way of saying a widow of somebody.
A relic.
A relic. Like, what a way to be known, you know? Usually relic, you think religious. Old.
Yeah.
Yeah, so listed in the deceased names in her manor indicated that her surname was the maiden name of her at her birth. But in this case, it refers to her last name when she died. After she died, Selden Booth bought out the other heirs to Lydia's property. Their house was just north of the Sofanowski Land Preserve at 155 Mort Vining Road. The land that was their property is now dotted with hiking trails that one can explore where the Booth family used to be. And unlike many farm families, Harriet and Selden only had 2 children. Their first was Charles, who served in the U.S. Civil War for the 61st Massachusetts Regiment from September 1864 to June 1865. After the war, he returned to Southwick with his bride, Ella Whitmarsh, and they had at least 7 children between 1868 and 1883. 3 of the children died before 1900. Edith, Effie, and Charles. Their daughter Cora married twice, first to a veterinarian, George M. Boone, who she divorced and then later married Clarence E. Skinner, who was younger than her. Their daughter Edna married Joseph L. Mueller in 1901. She died in 1915, leaving 16 children. No, 6, I'm wrong. I'm misreading my stuff. Walter, the only son to survive to adulthood, had 5 children, and his youngest, Charles Ernest Booth, served in World War II and is buried in an American cemetery overseas. Their daughter Harriet Hattie Booth was listed as a teacher on the 1880 census of Southwick. Harry married Samuel Vining, and she later died in Worcester, Massachusetts on October 12, 1895, age 39. And during my research so far, I have found that Homer Selden Vining, and it turns out her husband, Harriet's father-in-law was the Homer Vining. So Homer and Selden Vining is like, okay, but I'm still in the research of that part. And that's what I have here. So I don't know if any questions I know or no. You feel free to take a look at. I can pass that around if you'd like to.
Well, God bless you for showing up this beautiful October day. I'm Reverend Abriel Forward, and let me tell you a little bit about myself. I was born in this world on April 17th, 1748, in the Turkey Hills section of Simsbury. I guess they call it East Granby now. I was one of 11 children born of my honored mother and father, Lieutenant Abel and Hannah Phelps Forward. Now, not all of them made it to adulthood, and by the time I was a young man, of course, my mother was still having children. Now, let me tell you, I was named after both my father, Abel Forward, as well as my eldest brother, Abel Forward, who unfortunately passed away 3 years before I was born. So I was named after a dead sibling, you might say. Now, as a young kid, I remember quite a bit. My childhood tasks, of course, filled quite a bit of my day because Mom and Dad always had work for me. Let there be no doubt about that. Anyone here have to work? Oh, you understand. Now, I also attended district schoolhouse. Yes, there was a district schoolhouse in Turkey Hills. And also I had lots of siblings, and I had other neighborhood kids. So there was plenty to keep me out of mischief or in, depending upon which way you want to look at things. There was a lot of land that was cleared, but there was still lots of woods and plenty of places to discover, I'm going to say, in the wilderness. Now, there was a copper mine, for one thing, that was kind of interesting to kind of sneak to in those days. And but we didn't go down into the mine, actually, because that was a little bit too much for us.
Now, my parents were good Christians, instilling the need for loving other people just as Jesus did. Now, we attended Sunday worship in the meeting house of the Turkey Hills Ecclesiastical Society, Congregational, located on South Main Street. Now, it was 40 feet in length and 35 feet deep, 2 stories high, unpainted, and yes sirree, it had no steeple, as most churches at the time did. Services started in the mid-morning, and they continued to about dusk. So there was a noontime break there where we would go to some of the neighbors' homes, and we would all contribute to a good dinner before we went back and heard the rest of what the minister had to share with us. Now, during my teenage days, I developed a sense of calling to the ministry, just like my older cousin, Justice Ford, who served Belchertown as a minister. With the financial support of my parents, I attended Yale College in New Haven and graduated in 1768 with a degree in divinity. Now, one of my classmates was Samuel Fowler, son and namesake of Southwick's earliest known settler here. On November 7th of 1770, Southwick was carved out of Westfield. Now, I was invited to do some preaching in this newly formed community that following summer. On October 20th of 1772, a little over a year later, I married the love of my life, Keturah Collins, in Cheshire, Connecticut. She was a wonderful person, wonderful wife, and eventually a wonderful mother. Several months later, in January of 1773, I was the supply preacher at my native Turkey Hills Society meeting house. In many respects, this was a spiritual coming home for me, but it didn't culminate in any long-term appointment. Now, in Southwick, things were happening. On June 22nd of 73, the frame of its first meeting house was raised at the southwest corner of Bugby Road and College Highway. August 15th, the Southwick residents of the Congregational Church at Westfield, where they were members and had been attending, were dismissed from membership in order to form a new church. 2 days later, the Church of Christ in Southwick was formed with worship in the home of either John Root, who lives on what's now called Claus Anderson Road, or Benjamin Loomis, which was located right somewhere in the vicinity of that big white house behind you, and both, within a earshot of here. And Reverend Nehemiah Strong of Granby, Connecticut, did some hearty preaching that day, and as well as Reverend John Ballantyne of Westfield, he baptized a child there. 8 Southwick residents signed the new church covenant, and on September 26, Reverend Ballantyne preached at the unfinished but enclosed Southwick Meeting House, as I pointed out to you. A few weeks later, on October 14th, the first church meeting was held, and it was unanimously voted to call me as their first minister. A week later, I accepted the call, and the very next day, on a cold and rainy October 22nd, 1773, I was ordained and installed as Southwick's first minister. Now, as the town's minister, I was concerned with both the temporal and spiritual components of the lives of Southwick's citizens. I worked tirelessly to meet the many folks who called Southwick home. I prayed with them, guided them, developed a love for them. The response was glorious in the sight of God. We went from a mere 8 members to over 100. every Sunday morning was both a challenge and a blessing as I preached from the pulpit. Not everything, though, in life is perfect. My wife had a beautiful daughter whom we named Ketera Sophia, which the Lord called home at the age of only 3 months, buried here. The very next day, war broke out with Great Britain, and the shot heard round the world. And then, following year, in January of 1776, my wife was called home. I was brokenhearted. But with the absolute need to keep moving, I continued to preach, to counsel, and to meet my fellow town citizens. Luckily, I found a wonderful woman, and later, 15 months, I married Dorothy Stiles, a loving, intelligent, faithful woman, and over the years she blessed us with 3 daughters. While my ministry seemed to be just starting, during late 1785, I fell seriously ill. It was the Lord's wishes that I depart from this life, and on January 16th, 1786, I beckoned his call to come home. I can proudly state that my wife filled the pulpit on some of those Sundays. And thus ends this reading today.
Today I'm talking on the behalf of Julius Lee, who was a victim of one of the powder mill explosions in 1825. Or 1821. I had the wrong year. But there was at least 5 or more powder mills in Southwick that we know of. There could have been more, there could have been only 5. We're not sure. But the powder mills were mostly along 2 Mile Brook, which then got called Powder Mill Brook, and that was Great Brook. Right. Great Brook. And at 30 Powder Mill Road, there was a brown house that was built on the foundation of the last powder mill. Gunpowder mills made lots of money for the owners, and were very hazardous for the people that worked there, because one little spark could just destroy the entire building, and if there were any debris that flew off of one building, it could ignite another building, which create just a chain of just destruction. And so gunpowder is a mixture of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal. And all it takes is just one little flashpoint, and as I said, explosions. It was mostly used, but gunpowder itself was mostly used for guns during the Revolutionary War, or explosions in mines, up until dynamite was invented. But successful mills were typically set up in an arrangement of different rooms, where each room had its own specific purpose. Like one room would be creating the powder, one room would be making the barrels, another one would be combining the barrels, one would be another part where it's like adding the lids, sending it out, loading them up, stuff like that, the simple things. But in 1824, it was the year there was a lot of one major explosion that killed most of the people in the powder mill, and then leveled the whole building, and then a flood happened later that same year that washed out the rest of the buildings. And if you look here, these are a lot of the different victims. You have Chauncey Grannis, Reuben Clark, and 2 identified men that were in Granby, Anson Stiles and Jacob Buchanan, myself, Julius Lee, Luman Campbell, Mr. Carmel, Ensign Hughes, Harry Stocking, and 4 unidentified men. 21. We are not sure where he is from, but all we knew is he worked in powder mills in Southwick, to where he would inevitably die. They needed the money to support families, and it was cheap work. You were paid pretty okay, but it was the hazards outweighed the money, despite people still working there.
All right. Good day. My name is John Barnes. I was born on April 25th, 1830 in Southampton, Mass. I was the sixth of 7 children of a thankful Archibald Barnes. After I was born, there was plenty of kids around during that time for me to play with and have fun. And as I got older, once I was old enough, I would then help out around the farm. Eventually, I moved to Granby, Connecticut, where I met and fell in love with Ellen Perlina and Dibble. I always forget the last. On May 2nd of 1855, we tied the knot. And during our blissful marriage, between then and 1872, we had 13 children. Sadly, in that same time, we buried 6 of them. 4 of which are buried in Granby, Connecticut, and 2 are here, along with my daughter Cora, who died sometime later. In 1864, we bought a farm on both sides of the road leading from Westville to Simsbury. And at the time, I remember I had a horse, 2 oxen, 5 cows, a colt, and a pig. My house was a fine dwelling and 2 barns. And they really got me in taxes that year. It was $58.70. On the farm we grew hay for the livestock, and we fed the pigs the whey from cheese making. And we had a large garden, which my wife and daughters loved to, they worked in the garden all day. We'd pastures for cows on the west side of the farm. On the east side, we grew tobacco and as a cash crop, and my sons were a tremendous help. But as I understand it, with the farm, my grandson later on took my barns down and built this really nice red barn, which later on it was a red gable barn. And later it was converted to a fancy restaurant, and now it's a brewery.
It
was Chuck's.
Yeah, wow.
Unfortunately, the house where I raised my family and we had all those good times was torn down, and that's the parking lot. In September of 1864, I became a deacon, or I became a member of the Southwick Congregational Church, attended regularly, and 3 years later was selected as a deacon of the church. And I served not only that term, but one in 1891. The loss of my dear wife to consumption, which is tuberculosis, on April 4th of 1875 shook the family. She had been sick for a long time and required a great deal of attention. And when she passed on, I was left with my 7 children. Fortunately, my lovely neighbor, Emerette Boyington, said yes to my proposal in 1875 and turned out to be a wonderful wife and mother. In 1885, the Poverty District School burned down. that was concerning for me because my children had gone there. And I decided to help out by donating. I supported building of the school by donating the adjacent property to double the size of the property for the school. Eventually, I started to slow down, and I turned the farm over to one of my sons, William, and started slowing down a bit. The loss of my second wife in 1890 just really knocked it out of me. Luckily, I had my children and grandchildren to help fill the void. I'll let you share a little about a couple of my children. Most of my children stayed in the general area. I have children buried in Westfield and right here in the New Southwick Cemetery. I have a daughter who moved down to Thompsonville, where she is buried. I also have a son who actually moved out to Oakland, California. My youngest son, Albert, married a lovely girl named Jane Nicholas, Martha Jane Nichols' son. Of Southwick. Before she was born, her father had actually purchased the Joseph Moore House, and which is now in the collection of the Southwick Historical Society. It's actually the Southwick Historical Museum. And that leads to my demise. In about 1912, I started having stomach pains and complaints about my stomach. My grandson, the doctor, ultimately discerned that I had cancer of the stomach and offered me medicines and help slow the progression and ease the pain. But fortunately, on February 9th of 1915, I passed away. Then several years later, my children, when the Congregational Church was electrified, they donated a chandelier in my name to the church. That chandelier is actually in the Historical Society's collection. And I now leave you with simple words of advice: work hard, love God, and love people. And have a good day.
Welcome to Southwick's old burying ground. I'm Gene Thoreau. I'm one of 3 cemetery commissioners. When I came to the cemetery this afternoon, Pat Ordeon asked me if I could talk about Amasa Holcomb because one of our select board members, Doug Moglin, was scheduled to do it, but he came down sick. So with no preparation time, here I am. So I'm just going to stay to the point about the specifics that I'm well in tune with in memory without doing any research. So this is Reverend Amasa Holcomb. And I think probably one of the most interesting things is, during the course of living in the same house, he lived in 2 different states, 3 different counties, and 3 different towns. Because at that time, it was Simsbury, Connecticut, then became Suffield, Connecticut, Hartford County, then Hampshire County, Southwick, then Hampden County. There was no local district schools, so he was self-taught. He read a lot of books, and he was looking at a projection in the Farmer's Almanac, which he thought was incorrect. He identified it to him. They went with what they had versus what he had recommended. Turned out he was correct, so then he started writing his own equivalent to the Farmer's Almanac. And he also took the British telescopes, which were very expensive, and he re-engineered it and came out with a better product about 1/4 the price. So several of his telescopes are at the Smithsonian Institute. He also designed and manufactured his own cameras. He was a surveyor who sold the land that this cemetery is in, and he surveyed it. This is his family plot here. He was he had 2 wives. First one's here, and his second wife back there, Maria. And 2 of his children were Civil War veterans. One of them died in service during the war. This gravestone was a leaner, and you can see that it had cracks in it because it had steel pins in it. And what happened is they corrode, they expand, they contract, so it cracked the marble. So this particular gravestone was professionally conserved 3 years ago when we started the cemetery restoration, preservation, and conservation effort, which was my project. You based the priorities on the historical significance, and then leaners to preclude them, like that one over there. You see it snapped at the base, because when they lean, it puts a lot of stress on the bottom of the monuments. So you'll see that, before we got to them, a lot of those had happened. A lot of trees had come down. A tree limb came down and separated that one into 4 fragments. Several were broken over there, back there, and so a lot of them have been repaired over the last couple of years. And recently up there, David Ives, those huge tablets right there, in our next plot. The one on the far right was laying down. That was fixed about 5 weeks ago. And his wife's to the right of that, at our left, was leaning significantly, and that was fixed. So, anyone been to Blossoming Acres lately? Well, that was the farmhouse was the house he grew up in. Again, this is a last minute request for me to do this when I walked here, but I would suggest if you did a Google search on Amasa Holcomb, you'll be surprised about the amount of material that will come up on it, because he was quite a significant individual and contributed a lot in his lifetime.
What solution will you use between the stones?
It's called D/2 biological solution, and it's used by the National Park Service, the Department of the Interior, and the Veterans Administration. It's the only product that I would recommend and use on any kind of stonework. People with good intentions do a lot of damage that's unrecoverable damage. For example, you don't want to use any type of bleach, you don't want to use any type of salts. So there's 2 different ways of using D2. One is process, it's called instantaneous process, which what you do is you spray the stone, you wait 10 minutes, and then you come back and you have a garden sprayer with clean water in it. You have a bucket with brushes. You get the stone good and wet, and then you gently use the brush, beginning at the bottom in a circular motion, very gently, because a lot of people, they think they gotta scrub real hard. Well, all the staining is inside the stone.
Right.
Stones are porous.
Right.
So what you want to do is just get the surface stuff off, and then you rinse it real well. You don't want it to dry with the stuff on there. And then it's nice when you have small children doing this, because when you do the rinse and all that stuff is coming off, they think it's magic. It's so much different.
Can you purchase it somewhere? I have to do my parents' stone.
Atlas Preservation, they have a storefront in Southington, Connecticut.
Okay.
You can't buy it at Rockies, you can't
No,
buy it
I
anywhere.
didn't think so.
So if you go on the web and do a search on Atlas Preservation,
Okay.
and Jonathan Appel is a conservator, owns the business, and he goes out and he does a 48-state tour, a free cemetery preservation workshop. In fact, I used him last year in Westfield Oak Burying Ground on the 9th of October, no charge. And then he comes in and then teaches people how to do this stuff, how to properly do it, how to do a reset and do minor repairs on the gravestones. But, so his 3 children, they run the business, they run the storefront. So his 2 sons, one works purchasing, his other son does all the orders, and his daughter does the web and Facebook stuff.
Okay. Thank you.
And their the customer service is exemplary.
Oh, great.
I use them as my sole source for purchase of this stuff and for other things. So I do a lot of business with them both for in the town of Southwick on the community preservation project here for restoration, as well as Westfield, because I did Community Preservation Act submissions to do cemetery preservation work in the city-owned cemeteries as well as Pine Hill privately owned cemeteries. So
Thank you.
I've done a lot of work there too.
Were the stones quarried around here?
A lot of the marble comes from Vermont.
Okay.
The sandstone, some of the best sandstone was in Connecticut along riverbeds. A lot of it came from East Long Meadow, but it wasn't all quality. So like you go up front, you'll see a lot of these sandstones that some people commonly will call them as brownstones, that they're delaminating and the facing is all coming off. In fact, there's 4 young girls that drowned in Southwick in 1809. 2 Cannon sisters, another one was a Langdon, and I forget the 4th one's name, but the 3 girls are on a sandstone monument up there, and all the facing is gone. And then there's a footstone behind it, and then the Mary Langdon was one of the other girls that drowned, is on the right-hand side. So we can't fix those sandstones, but I'm getting a price and we're going to replace them with the same color granite, because to me, just as any other parent,
Exactly.
I can't imagine the loss of a child, and particularly under circumstances such as Calvin Cannon, Clark Cannon. At any rate, he was standing on shore. The girls were out there in a canoe, and a handkerchief fell over, and all 4 of them went to the side of the canoe to try to retrieve the handkerchief, and so it tipped over, and the 4 girls drowned, and the Cannon father was standing on the shore less than 60 feet away, and he drowned in 8 feet of water because he did not know how to swim. So can you imagine watching your children drown and you're helpless, learning about it, and then live out the rest of your days like that? I think I'd probably be having nightmares every single night.
Is it the same Holcomb as Holcomb Farm in Granby?
No, that's a good question. There's a lot of Holcombs. You know, there could be, you know, they could very well be related. And there's a lot of Holcombs also in Westfield. And of course, there's a Holcomb Street in Westfield too. And there's Holcomb roads named after Holcomb in Connecticut as well. It's a very prominent early American family. And
Everybody here? Hello, everybody.
Hello.
My name is Maud Etta Gillette and Davis, and I was born in 1884, and I died in 1955, and I am buried here at the cemetery with my parents, Edward Gillette, who was born in 1849 and died in 1931, and my mom, Jenny Viding, who was born in 1858 and died in 1942. And then Mortimer was my older brother. He was a baby when he died. He was only a year old. Of course, I didn't know him because I was born after that. But, oh, well, actually, he was born when I was like 10, but he didn't live very long. Now, my dad was a Gillette. Gillette is a known, well-known name in town. There's an area in town called Gillette Corners. Anybody know where Gillette Corners is? You're nodding your head. Where is it?
Yeah, it's over with the, I'm sorry? Ulysses, yeah, in that area.
No, it's not. It's not
It's
where
on the way to
Malicious is.
Connecticut. It's on the way to Connecticut.
It's where
Where the Copper Hill Road and all that? No?
no, that's Ebb's Corner. Gillette Corner is where the McDonald's is and CVS
I did not know.
and that there is one house that's still there. It's now part of the Dunkin' Donuts that's there, but that was my family's farm, Gillette Corners, back in the 1800s. And my mother was a Vining, Jenny Vining. Can you guess where she lived in town?
Vining Hill Road.
Because all this, Vinings lived in that area. Mort Vining Road was one of my uncles. That was her, where she came from, Mom. When my mother and father got married, they moved to a house, a big white house that's on College Highway, which is 2 houses down from the old library. It's still there. And my father ran a business out of that house for almost 50 years. It was called Gillette's Wildflower Farm, and he would raise wildflowers. He got interested in it when he was a kid. He would go out in the woods and find different kinds of flowers and grow them and get the seeds. He also grew azaleas and rhododendron, and he would sell them all over the world. People would search for Gillette's wildflowers and buy the seed packets, and he would be sending them all over the world. Right here from Southwick, it's kind of amazing that was going on. My brother Kenneth took over for my dad when my dad died, and then shortly after that, his son, also named Kenneth, took over the business. And then Kenneth was sent to war in World War II, and he was killed during the war. So his brother Thornton, who we believe was named after Thornton Burgess, who was a friend of the family, was the final one running the business with my mom up until almost 1950 when it was closed. So back to me, Maud, I got married to Bill Davis. Bill was a preacher, and we got married right in the Congregational Church, right here in the center of Southwick, with Bill's dad, who was also a preacher. And being a preacher took us out of Southwick, and we ended up living in the Adirondacks in New York. And that's where we lived until Bill died when he was 55 years old, and I came back to Southwick to live. But all the time that I had gone from Southwick, I was really interested in the history of Southwick. Who was here? I would be getting letters from my friends and talking to them. So after I moved back to Southwick, I decided that I would write a history of Southwick. So that's exactly what I did. I wrote a book. This is the book that I wrote. It was published, I wrote it in July of 1951, and it's called Historical Facts and Stories About Southwick. And I was probably about 67 or 68 at the time that I put all of this together. It's 249 pages long, and it's all typewritten. It's all hand typewritten. And this is my history of Southwick. Most of the town facts that you read, the other books that are written about Southwick, they use a lot of the information that was in my book that was published or written in 1951. It was actually not published until 1982 when the Southwick Historical Society found out about it, and they decided to publish it and got permission from Mary, my daughter, to publish this book. So it has all kinds of chapters. It talks about the churches. It talks about the schools in town. Does anybody know how many one-room schoolhouses there were in town? Any idea? Want to take a guess? Take a guess. 3? 9. Back then, in every district had its own schoolhouse. There are actually some of those schoolhouses that are still standing. They are private homes now, but there were 9 of them. Why don't we have them anymore? What do they do with them? Why did they close? Because they built one school and put all of the schools in it, and it's what's the name of it? No, it wasn't Powder Mill. It was called Consolidated School because they consolidated 9 schoolhouses and put them together in Consolidated School. My dad, Edward Gillette, was on the committee in the 1920s that worked on getting that school built. Now, if you go, that school's still in use today, but it's not a school anymore. What is it?
Town hall.
It's our town hall. And if you go to pay your taxes, which I just did, if you go to pay your taxes there, if you look at the front of the building, it says Consolidated 1928. That was the school that was built, and all the one-room schoolhouses were all closed. One of the other things that was written in here was about the ice industry here in Southwick. Hockanum lakes are very pure, clean lakes because there's no inlets. There's no water that goes into Southwood. It comes up from under the ground, so it's very pure water. And they would harvest the ice. There were 5 different ice houses here. Anybody got any idea how far away they sold that ice to? There's trains. New York City. Actually, the ice from Southwick went to New York City, most of it. And they would cut it in January and February, big chunks, and then they would store it in these big warehouses packed with sawdust, and then it would be usable all year round. They could go and get it in July. It would still be the layers at the bottom would still be frozen. So ice right here from Southwick went to New York City. It was wanted. People wanted this. And one of the other interesting things in here is about people who lived in this town. And one of them, I found his story very interesting. His name was Lincoln, and he lived on Vining Hill. And Lincoln liked to drink a bit, and his wife, they had 11 children, and she got tired of him drinking so much. So she took all 11 kids and moved away and left him behind. He was the town veterinarian. He stayed behind. And when she took the kids, they left the toys that they were playing with, whatever it was, and they never took the toys, and he never moved them. He would pick them up and he would clean under them, but he'd put them back down because he was sure that they were going to come back one day and want those toys, and unfortunately they never did. So he kind of died a lonely man without his kids. But he did have a mule, and when he took a vacation, which was rare, he would wash and clean his mule, and then he would buy 2 casks full of whiskey, and he would share some of the whiskey with his mule, and that was his vacation every year. So Mary, my daughter, was born in 1922, not here in Southwick because we were away at the time, but she died here in the year 2012, and she is the last person that was buried in this part of the cemetery. She was buried in 2013. There has not been another burial in the old part of the cemetery since 2013. She was the last one. As a matter of fact, her name is on the back of the gravestone there. It says her name and when she was born, but it doesn't say 2013 because there was no one left in the family to put her date on the gravestone. Interesting. So that's me, Maud Etta Gillette Davis.
Welcome to come a little closer if you want. I'm just a creepy old lady in the cemetery with an axe. My name is Martha Eloise Vining Coombs Ottenheimer. I'm one of the only people you'll see here today that's not actually buried in this cemetery. I'm here to tell you a story about my father, Lester Vining. That pink headstone is where he's buried. It involves him and this axe. But he doesn't know the ending of the story, and I don't want to cut you off, so I'm here to tell you the complete story. My father was born in 1852. He grew up on a farm that had been handed down through his family from his grandfather to his father, and then eventually it became his farm. It was on Vining Hill Road, right by the corner where Mort Vining joins. The house is no longer there. In the mid-70s, a young man was mad at his girlfriend that lived there, so he decided to burn it down. Imagine murdering someone by burning their house down. My father, when he was about 21, got into a little trouble in the Southwick Hotel, which is now the Southwick Inn. He and his brother decided to attack a man who had a mental disability, so they started hitting him with chairs, got into a little trouble. He eventually grew up and he married my mother, who is also buried here with him. They had a couple of children. One died as an infant, one died as a toddler. You probably can't see it, but there's a tiny white headstone. They're both buried there. And then my mother and my sister Orpha are also buried here. My father went to a one-room schoolhouse across the street from where he lived. That house is still there. It's a light-colored brown house. I was born in 1887 on October 20th, so I just had a birthday.
Happy birthday.
Thank you. I look good for 135 years old, don't I? Thank you.
What's your secret?
I'll tell you later. I also, and my sisters and my brother, went to the same one-room schoolhouse that's on Vining Hill Road. Eventually I grew up and I got married to a man from Pittsfield who decided to get a girlfriend, so we got divorced, whatever. I lived with my sister Orpha in Springfield for a while and then decided I needed to kind of be independent and leave my sister, so I moved back to Southwick and I worked for the Saunders family, taking care of some elderly members of the family. My mother passed away. I remarried a man named Francis Ottenheimer from Connecticut, and I decided that since my father was elderly and alone, instead of caring for someone else's parents, I should be caring for my own. So I moved back to Vining Hill Road with my husband Francis. That was in 1937, in December. A few weeks later, because it wasn't going so well, I tried to kill myself, and my father called his friend Dr. Samuel Finson, and he sent me to the Northampton State Hospital for the insane. I didn't like it there. Everybody there was just not right. And then in February, my husband called and said, "Can she come home for a visit?" And the doctor said, "Of course. All she does is smile. She's so cooperative. That would be a great idea." Was it? A couple weeks later, Francis called back and said, "She's great. Can she just stay?" The doctor said, "Sure, why not?" And then in April, I was looking at my father. He was old and frail, wasted down to nothing. I had to do something to take care of him. So I took this axe and took care of him. And then I called Dr. Samuel Finson, and I said, "I've just murdered my father, come and have a look." And he came. I was sitting on the couch. I said, "I did it. Why don't you take my husband with you too before I hurt him?" They took my father away in an ambulance where he died on the way to the hospital. They took this away from me because they said I was deranged and they needed to use it as evidence. And then do you know what they did? They sent me back to that hospital in Northampton, the one with the crazy people. Do you know what happened after that? No one does. But I can tell you, some of the people are buried in a hayfield there. Some of the people that died had their bodies shipped off to doctors that were learning how to cut people up. You know what happened to me? No. Until 2007, when the state police were cleaning out their evidence locker, they found this axe. They read the label on it. They called Chief Krenicki and said, "Would you like to have this?" He said, "Sure." And then he called Mr. Lee Hamburg from the Southwick Historical Society and said, "Can you tell me anything about this axe?" And he did. And then they invited me to come here, and the band is back together. Before I open it up to questions, I have one question. Any of you know a single young man? We need someone else to take care of. No? Thank you.